What shall we call him if he's a boy, Owen? Her voice, just then, was more than he could bear. Nothing makes human nerves dance with such a blind fury as a voice piercing the hollow of the ear at the moment when the will is stretched out like a piece of India rubber on the rack of indecision. "Torture!" he shouted, sitting up in the purple chair and clutching its elbow furiously, while the rim of her hat was now completely crushed beneath him. "We'll call him Torture, and if she's a girl we'll call her Finis, the end. For she'll be the end, and all is the end." Cordy's face went white as the surface of the little china pussycat which Crummy had given her, and which now fell over sideways as she jerked her arm from the mantelpiece. But she wasn't the daughter of Gerd of Glastonbury for nothing. Incontentedly, she rushed straight to his side. "You're unhappy, Owen. You're ill. You're hurt. Something's horrible's troubled you." He pushed her arms away. He lurched to his feet. He bent down and picked up his bowler hat, which was lying on its smooth crown, its dirty interior uppermost. "It's nearly sunset," he muttered. "If I don't go now, I'll never go." "Where are you going, Owen?" He looked at her wildly. "Well, he must be stopped, mustn't he? It's one thing or the other, isn't it?" "What are you talking about, Owen? Are you crazy?" "Oh, nothing. 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 Nothing!" he muttered. "You don't want to see me in the dark, do you?" "In the dark, woman." These last words came from him with a wild shout. Cordy glanced at the brown blinds, which were bulging a little. There was a wind blowing up. She went to the door leading into the passage, locked it, and placed her back against it. "You don't leave this room, Owen," she gasped. He was now buttoning up his black overcoat. His hat was on his head, pressing down so low over his eyes that his eyebrows were invisible. This produced a most curious effect as he glared at her from under its shadow. But an unexpected change of mood came upon him. He began wheedling and coaxing and imploring. "It's only a little way, just up the hill. It's necessary to... Necessary, very necessary. Please move, Cordy, and let me go. You'll be sorry if you don't. You won't forgive yourself afterwards if you don't." He almost wept as he beseeched her. In his own mind just then, to stop a murder and to taste an appalling sweetness were motives both lost in the wild necessity he was in to get out of this room. But she kept her eyes upon him all the time, and she now noticed that he had begun casting a furtive, hurried, crafty look at the window. Nothing indeed would have been easier for him than to lift up that bulging blind and get out of that window. "I must do something to keep him here," she thought. "And I mustn't struggle with him, because of the child. Besides, he'd hit me. He'd hit me savagely." A wild, strange thought came to her then. Came to her from seeing the look at that lowered blind. Very often in the evening she had undressed for his pleasure, with the blind pulled down like that, and the door locked. She began feverishly stripping off her clothes. He followed every moment of her hands with those burning eyes under the shadow of that bowler. His coat was buttoned up tight under his chin. He looked like a man ready to rush out upon pikes or bayonets. Crossing her arms over his chest, she pulled her dress over her head and then her slip. Then she unloosened her petticoat and drawers. Stamping with her feet, she extricated herself from these objects, letting her stockings and shoes remain. Backing against the door, she bent down and pulled off her vest, dragging it over her head. This final movement, when her head was bent low, and when her face was hidden, and when the garment, dragging forward by her eager hands, was caught for a second on one of her hairpins, did stir some deep chord of excited desire in the man with the burning eyes. He snatched off his hat and flung it into the purple chair. But she rose up to her full height now, her back still to the door, her long arms hanging limp by her sides, her chin lifted high, her head thrown back. Mr. Evans came slowly towards her. Poor Cordy's figure was anything but classical. She resembled a nude of Cranach, but there was such a heroic abandonment about her pose, and her eyes shone with such a lustrous appeal, that something happened within that other locked room, the one containing the iron bar. Not for nothing was this brave girl the child of Gerd of Glastonbury. Roused to the uttermost, her soul suddenly became a psychic force, a magnet of destruction, an annihilation ray, and the murderous instrument summoning up page 77 of that fatal book crumbled into a pinch of dust. Grotesque and Cranach-like, though poor Cordy's naked body was, it was the body of a woman still. It was the ultimate symbol, the uttermost glykeness of life's wild experiment. Grotesque it might be, as nakedness went, but combined with the look she managed to fling, like a passion of immortal wine over the dark flame of his obsession, it overcame, it triumphed. 1 hour later, Mr. Evans and Cordelia might both have been seen jumping with frantic haste out of Solly Lou's taxi, and to the astonishment of that not easily surprised conveyor of mortal men, racing with desperate impatience up the slope of Gwyn ap Nudd's hill. "They're here, Cordy, they're there, I see them," panted Mr. Evans, trying in vain to outdistance Mr. Gaird's daughter. It had been with some reluctance that Tossie Stickles, now for some heavenly months Tossie Barter, had been persuaded to leave her babies and accompany her husband and John Crow on that fanciful excursion to see the night fall over Glastonbury from the summit of the tour. Barter himself had been followed by one good piece of luck after another ever since they had been married. He had hired spacious and airy rooms in the same house in Northload Street where John and Mary lived, and between the two ménages there had been unruffled and uninterrupted harmony. With the enthusiasm of the new regime of Glastonbury, he had been entirely freed from the annoying presence of Red Robinson at the factory. Robinson had now become what might be called the third triumvir among the magnates who, under Mr. Gaird, dictatorily administered the affairs of the small community, and Barter was at liberty to manage the making of souvenirs entirely at his own discretion. The one topic of conversation in those days that Barter indulged in, and upon which he expatiated an inordinate length to Mary when they were alone, was what had been the psychological reason for the miserable way in which he had lived before he met Tossie. Into Mary's private thoughts, and they were subtle and ironical enough, as she listened to these discourse, it is not necessary to go. But what she said to Barter was that all unattached men are curiously ignorant of what things a girl can do, such was Mary's expression, to make life pleasant. Meanwhile, so happy was Tom Barter these days that in a brief 2 months his whole expression changed and the whole cast of his countenance was altered. He positively looked fatter, too, and his manner of speech was different. He spoke in a tone much more easy, much more assured. It was their Rabelaisian sense of humor that was one of the greatest links between Tom and Tossie. And mornings and night, with the twins sometimes included and sometimes not, their fits of giggling and chuckling and unrestrained laughter, going on and on and on, made the second story of that gloomy old house sound as if a party of hilarious schoolboys were staying the night with a party of hilarious schoolgirls. The mention of school is relevant enough in this connection, for what this vita nueva of Tom Barter really meant was that Tossie had picked up what might be called the man's lost flesh and blood pride just where he had dropped it in his youth under his unlucky experience at Gladman's House of Greylands. Something in him, some psychic organ full of delicious animal gusto for simple things, and an invincible desire to giggle at everything in existence, had been restored to him by his contact with Tossie, and not only this, for it soon became apparent, even to John and Mary, that Barter was no longer afraid to stand up, as Tom would put it, to they bloomin' gentry. This aspect of what the girl had done for him had been brought especially into evidence of late by reasons of his association with Lady Rachel, who, still unmarried to young Atheling, but still constantly at his side, found herself asking Barter, in place of anybody else, to meet her father whenever he came to the Pilgrimses. So that's why I get confused. I thought Tom Barter was with Ned Atheling earlier. With Lady Rachel, but Lady Rachel is still with Ned Atheling. I'm glad that's cleared up. Lord P. was constantly coming to the Pilgrims now, not because he loved the communistic Glastonbury, for he was still excessively nervous of the mob that had attacked him, but because he had become seriously worried about Rachel's relations with her Ned. And the queer thing was that when his Norfolk youthfulness restored to him, and the Gladman House years erased from his life by these perpetual giggling fits with Tossie, Barter proved much more a match for the elderly nobleman and a much more agreeable table companion to him than anyone else that Rachel could have picked up. Lady Rachel's own genius, too, for these little souvenir figures that his factory was now turning out by the thousands and sending all over the world, had by this time really got Barter interested in his job. The souvenir factory was doing by far the most flourishing business in Glastonbury. More money was being made by it than either by the new dye works that the municipality had communized, or by the old dye works that Philip was still running, and far more than by the Crow tin mine at Wookey, which now began to show signs of having exhausted its vein of the precious metal. And Barter's professional pride, as the head of so flourishing a business, being mingled with his new psychological self-respect and his new freedom from the wearisome hunt for erotic novelty, made him just now the happiest and best balanced male animal in the town. Although in the intoxication of pure zest for life in his essence, he was probably surpassed not only by his own radiant Tossie, but also by Tossie's relatives by marriage, the beautiful and mystical Nancy. "'Tis a shame," Tossie remarked to Mary as she poured out tea for her and John while awaiting Barter's return from the factory. "'Tis a shame for you to say and look after the kids. They'd really stay asleep just as they be, and no one would disturb 'em if I just locked up this place." "I wouldn't think of it, Toss, dear," said Mary emphatically. "So don't speak of it again. Tom will be back soon, John, so don't finish the tea cakes." "I wasn't thinking of finishing them," protested John indignantly. "But to make sure, I'll put 'em on the stove, if I may, Toss." He rose as he spoke and replaced the dish in question near the big smoking tea kettle. Ooh, I'll end there because this is a long paragraph. So they're having some scones or something. Till next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.